Great. Okay, great. Thanks. So let's get started. As before, I'm going to review some of the content from yesterday, day 3, and we'll also have some space for any questions that you may have about yesterday's content. Again, thanks to Renzo for preparing these slides this morning, and it's my pleasure to provide this review today. Oops. Wait a minute. Okay, great. And so, yeah, just a recap of where we have been, where we are, and where we're going. So yesterday, our topic was interpretation and modeling. We heard many lectures on this topic. Okay, great, thanks. Today will be advanced applications and future directions, ending with our keynote lecture from Peter Bannattini. Again, just as a reminder for both our in-person attendees as well as our friends over Zoom, immediately after Peter's lecture, we're going to have a group photo, again, both in person and Zoom. So friends over Zoom, prepare your cameras. We're going to set up a couple of screenshots and we can organize underneath the screen so that we can all be in the photo together. So looking forward to that immediately after Peter's lecture. Okay, so what did we go over yesterday? Interpretation and modeling. So we started with Farouk, who gave a great lecture teaching us about how it's actually pretty difficult to measure distances in the cortex. We need to be thinking in 3 dimensions. We heard a lot about Bock's equivolume principle, and we saw that this equivolume layering explains a lot of the variance, not all, but it appears to be able to capture these laminar features, much more than the sort of simple kind of equidistant, layerification methods. So we can see this, quite clearly here. We also heard from Anna, who told us about how to perform visualization. She taught us about, how to generate, laminar profiles. She taught us about 2D visualizations, flattening. She showed us about how to smooth the data as well. And again, this laminar smoothing helps us to visualize the activation, but she cautioned us to make sure to look at and show both the unsmoothed data and smooth data to make sure that in the smooth data, we're not seeing any kind of spurious activations. She showed us a lot of conventional methods for flattening the cortex, for inflating the cortex to represent these 2-dimensional sort of topographic patterns as shown in the video on the bottom here. And she also showed us some new work, not just flattening these 2-dimensional surfaces, but flattening 3-dimensional volumes. So this movie from Farouk, let me play it again. Showing how we can visualize, chunks of the cortex to be able to kind of visualize both the 2-dimensional, columnar structures as well as laminar structures in one view. We talked about how these flattenings are good for visualization, but we also talked about how they introduce, some metric distortions. So again, we use these for the kind of qualitative representations of the data. We also talked about how we can measure these metric distortions in order to quantify in case the geometric properties of the data are of primary concern. And so then Renzo gave his hands-on both in the morning and the afternoon. There were many obstacles, many challenges to this hands-on session. So again, thanks for bearing with us, especially that, I don't know if you received this, Anna, this sort of alarming kind of national alert, in the middle of Renzo's hands-on. All of a sudden, everyone's phones started to scream. And so, but it was challenging, but I think we learned a lot, during this. It's, pretty tough to do these live demos. And so Renzo showed us there's no magic to get these layer profiles. He walked us through this process and it was actually, I think, pretty straightforward, So it was great to see this in action, and he showed us, several tricks, to help us, remove noise from the data in the afternoon, showing us how to use the Nordic method to remove this thermal noise and to better see kind of the true activations within the data. And then Jing'en presented reviewed a lot of work on kind of laminar connectivity, explained to us, how laminar connectivity, laminar functional connectivity can help us to decipher circuits. She showed us, these first sort of exploratory studies that suggest how these resting state functional connectivity using layer fMRI can allow us to ask new questions about connectivity across networks, both causality, looking at, distinguishing between feed-forward and feedback connections. Of course, in order to interpret these data, we need to know which are the input layers, which are the output layers on these pathways. But again, lots of data coming in. How do we make sense of these data? I think that many of these studies are exploratory, giving us some insights that we still need to validate in animal models. And then Camille talked to us a lot about how to model these laminar fMRI signals. He talked to us about this sort of draining vein problem, again, that this deoxygenated blood kind of gets drained upwards towards the surface and results in this sort of accumulative signal displacement. I think he showed some really maybe counterintuitive examples about how the sort of underlying blood flow signal may exhibit kind of peaks in activation, whereas the bolt signal is not just sort of blurred, but we see some sort of displacements in those peaks. I thought that was pretty insightful. And he showed us how, just simply removing these trends of the activation across steps, may not be sufficient, whereas these deconvolution approaches that are based on these models of how the blood is sort of drained upwards can help us to reverse these accumulation effects. And so I thought that was, very helpful. Okay, great. And then we had a great discussion at the end of the day. Actually, Anna, this was sort of a highlight for me. It was a lot of fun. We had a session all about how to publish, layer fMRI studies. It was great because lots of the faculty were able to jump in and kind of weigh in on these topics as well as pose questions. I think some of the key points that came out of this discussion was that, writing matters. We talked about clarity. Peter shared, a lot of wisdom about how it's important to have, some kind of, key insight, even for methodological papers, as long as we learn something, as long as we can make clear what the insights are. I think that a lot of these methodological studies, should be published. And we also talked about how to deal with rejections and just acknowledging that these rejections, can be painful, of course, but it's really, we need to still incorporate, feedback from the reviewers. I think that, I mentioned, Peter kind of echoed that, reviewers are often trying to help, and sometimes when they don't understand, the message from our studies, that doesn't mean that they are, wrong or sort of just didn't get it. Oftentimes it means that we weren't kind of clear enough. And so we need to make sure to incorporate those comments, revise and resubmit. And that was a fun discussion. And so as in previous days, I tried to think about, thinking about all of the lectures, what points, kind of came up in multiple of these presentations? What are the overall themes from yesterday? And I think that what I saw across multiple lectures is that, oftentimes prior information about the anatomy, as we heard from Farouk, connectivity, as we heard from Jingren, physiology, as we heard from Camille, is needed for the laminar fMRI analysis and interpretation. We needed to know how the layers shift with the folding pattern. We need to know, how can we pool our voxels? How large of an ROI or small of an ROI should we be using? Again, a lot of assumptions going into the size of the ROI. We need to assume that the activity or the intensity of all the voxels across layers are consistent within this ROI, and that's really important to choose. How smooth or noisy are the data? Like how much noise can we remove? What smoothness priors can we impose on these data in order to, again, separate out kind of signal of interest from noise? Again, for the interpretation, we need to know what are the input layers and what are the output layers. I do think that these sort of exploratory analyses, as we discussed yesterday, can be useful to kind of set up potential hypotheses to test in animal models. But oftentimes, the interpretation of these data, if you see a bump in a particular layer, knowing whether that indicates feed forward or feedback requires some prior knowledge about the conductivity. And of course, we need to know how this, deoxygenated blood is drained out of the cortex. We need to understand, like these hemodynamics and how they relate back to the neural activity. And so we also saw that many sources of error that are incurred both through the data themselves, but in these analysis stages can be quantified. Sometimes they can't be fully removed, but at least we can generate these error bars. I feel like this came up over and over. Maybe it was me who kept saying this, but I do think this is an important message. Sometimes we can't remove the error, but as long as we can quantify it, it's something that we can incorporate into our interpretation. And we saw both from Jingren's talk and Camille's talk how models of both within area connections and across area connections can be used to extract more information from these layer fMRI data, again, to try to understand these pathways, understand the neural computations that are giving rise to the patterns that we're measuring. And I think I also saw that our field is, we're seeing like a lot of great technologies yesterday on the analysis side, especially on the modeling side. And our field has really matured, quite a lot. I think that I was really impressed by, a lot of what we saw yesterday. And we're seeing, especially in our discussion about publications, we're seeing studies really shifting from kind of methods development to scientific application, and that's a big shift. However, reviewers can still be skeptical, picky. I think that as our methods get better and better, I think that reviewers' expectations are also increasing in terms of what they expect in terms of methodological rigor. We talked about that a bit during this session on publications. Okay, so that's what I saw yesterday. I want to point out, my slides are in order again. Oops, I guess I missed this slide. I made another slide about, there's a lot going on Slack. I was actually pretty happy to see, we saw another spike in activity with Slack, especially during Renzo's hands-on session. I guess my screenshot didn't make it to this final version, but please, go to Slack. If you have any questions, things pop into your mind offline, please post them. I think the faculty are doing a great job responding to these questions, so please, faculty also take a look. There's great discussions on Slack, and Tyler and I will make sure that any remaining questions that have not been addressed get forwarded to the most appropriate faculty member. And so with that, we have a couple of minutes for questions. Again, we'll have more time during the break. We'll have more time during lunch to interact. But I wanted to see whether there are any sort of lingering questions. I think during the day, I think we had lots of great kind of clarification questions, but did anybody have any open questions for now based on the content from yesterday that they'd like to have answered? Renzo, anything that I may have missed from your perspective, or?